Morning. What an amazing good morning. Crowd around here. Thank you all for coming this morning, for getting up. Students, yes, students that I see here, I am super, super impressed. I'd like to welcome, on behalf of President Green, seated up here, senior staff colleagues and faculty colleagues in the room, our students. Can I have a hand for the great Goldfarb students who checked you all in? And most especially alums and families. My name is Patrice Franco, and I'm the director of the Goldfarb Center. And I'm very pleased with my partners in college advancement to welcome you all here today. I also want to have a quick thank you before that door closes for our colleagues in dining services who have pulled this As we're in the midst of Jewish holidays, in addition to the Shana Tova, good wishes for a good year to all, it may be appropriate to frame today's panel with the Hebrew phrase, Lador, Lador, from generation to generation. Now, for some of you saying, she's speaking Hebrew up there, I just want to note that even though I was raised in a Catholic tradition, my husband, Sandy, thinks that I am his best Jewish wife. And we're here today to honor and thank the donors to the Sandy Maisel Fund. This group, led by members of the class of 1978 and their spouses, inspired others to join them in raising an endowment to support student internships and fellowships in public affairs. This generation, our friends, was paying forward the investment that Sandy made in them. Since 2016, 48 Maisel Fund students have held internships or research experiences during Januaries or summers, facilitating their professional development. In the past 2 years, this gift has supported our Washington, D.C.-based facilitated internship program, where we not only place and fund students, but also use the deep Colby D.C. network to connect students to the world of opportunity. And as an aside, parents in the room from the D.C. area, it would be wonderful if you could join Michelle and Jim Bowe, Colby parents, in the ways that they've reached out and helped host our group in DC. So if you have any DC-based ideas, bring them on, let me know. Donors, when I think about your gift, I'm overwhelmed by the lives you have changed in this current generation of students. We know that these talented students will be change makers, passing their gift forward in this world. Along with recognition for those who cannot be here, I'd like to ask all who have contributed to the Maisel Fund to stand and be recognized. Their gift, the idea for their gift began with a hot tub conversation at our home between Dan and Doug Kaplan. They were on a stopover on their way to Sugarloaf. The idea was somehow fed by eating my cherry pecan chocolate chip cookies on the drive. They may be thinking, very expensive cookies. We've had a batch or multiple batches, thanks to the Goldfarb Assistant Director, Sherry, of these cookies made for all in the room to enjoy as you go along your way. and remember the gift of one generation to another. So get your chocolate cherry chip cookies, man. Lador also captures our panel. Representative Barney Frank was Sandy's instructor in government at Harvard. Along with other mentors, Barney nurtured in Sandy a love for politics. This passion has passed from generation to generation. Literally, as Sandy has now taught more than 50 children of alums. Over his 48, now going on to 49 years of teaching at Colby, he has mentored generations of students who have taught him a thing or two. We could recount the ways that Kaplan tried to teach him how to dress, or Susan Kenyon, that's an insider joke, or Susan Kenyon tried to coach organization as his campaign manager when he ran for Congress in 1978. But on this panel we have Hannah Dineen, class of 1917, representing the younger end of the Maisel generational spectrum. Hannah challenged Sandy to hold to his own ethical standards in teaching. Asked them what happened. The result was their co-edited book, Trumping Ethical Norms. Lador. As professors, we are so lucky to work with this bright, engaged generation, having them in our lives, and cherish the alumni friendships that so enrich us. Thank you all for being here, and let's turn to our panel. Sandy, the Goldfarb Family Distinguished Professor of Government, was the founding director of the Goldfarb Center and served from 2003 through 2012. In addition to over 40 chapters and articles, he's written 13 books, one famously titled From Obscurity to Oblivion, running in a congressional primary. Sandy will introduce Barney and Hannah before turning to our conversation on covering the 2020 elections. So please join me in thanking them for being here.
Thank you, Patrice. Patrice has been spending this weekend doing introductions for an incredible Lovejoy program that I know many of you shared in, and I hate to look like it's nepotism, but I think we should all thank Patrice for it. So I am indeed honored. I wrote to some of the students about this event. I said, the single honor of my professional career has been to have this fund named in bearing my name, to have these good friends of mine, and I don't want to name them all, but I see Doug and Ann, and I see Susan, and I see Danny, and I see Jeff and Robin, and I see Chris and the Allens, and so many of you who have contributed, Sam and Susan, so many of you who have contributed to this fund, and it is something that I am so proud of because it will carry on what I think is so important about what we do at Colby, which is to prepare our students to take the lessons that we learn in the classroom and carry them forward to the workplace to make a difference in their lives. And I hope you have a chance to talk to the Maisel Fellows who are around the room. One of whom at least has two Maisel Fellows that he has been on, and others who have had great life-changing experiences. For me, one of my first life-changing experiences was taking Gov 1A in, we think, 1963 at Harvard. And Barney and I were talking earlier about what course he taught me in, and we sort of deconstructed it by who the other people around the course were. But I said to him, what's fascinating to me is, I can't remember what course it was, I remember the lesson. And for those of you who've taken Government 111 from me and have heard me talk about separation of powers and checks and balances, and you didn't like it, this is where it all began. But what Barney taught me, the department at Harvard, like the department at Colby, is the government department. And what Barney taught me is that you could be somebody who studies government as a political scientist, but really understand government. And Barney, of course, left the Harvard government department, went on to work for Mayor Kevin White, went on to get a law degree from Harvard, and then to be, for decades, a public servant. We remember his first campaign when he ran for state representative. Those of you who are of a certain generation may remember the single best campaign poster ever put out, which was a picture of Barney looking quite rumpled, and it said, "Neatness isn't everything, Frank for state representative." He was successful. And then an incredibly distinguished career in the House of Representatives, culminating for years as chairman of the Financial Services Committee and as the co-author of the very impactful, I said that the other day, people told me impactful wasn't a word, I looked it up, it is a word. the impactful Dodd-Frank bill. I want to just say two things about how Barney helped me while he was a member of Congress. Two things which made a great deal of difference to me. He may not remember either of them. I was writing my first book, Beyond, From Obscurity to Oblivion, which ended up being a textbook now in its 7th generation on parties and elections. And the purpose of this textbook was to say, you can, basically what I've tried to live in my teaching life, which is you need to know the substance, but you have to be able to apply it to the real world. And I needed to talk to real world politicians, and Barney was great. I was grateful that Barney was willing to speak to me. And we were talking about campaign finance, and all of a sudden, and I'm talking about, why I can't get a campaign finance bill, this, that, and the other thing. And Barney said, look, I'll vote for any campaign finance bill that does public funding. I said, really? We can't get that through Congress. He said, every incumbent should vote for it. If I have the same amount of money as my opponent has, he then being the incumbent, he said, I'm going to win every time I run. Well, that was the first edition of this book. I no longer am the author of the book. I have a junior colleague who took over the book. That quote is still in the book because it is so meaningful about how Washington works. That's one. Second time was in probably 98, 99 maybe. I had done a project called the Candidate Emergence Study, which I still have been involved in until very recently, which we tried to look at why the pool of candidates who ran for Congress wasn't improved. And we did a survey of people throughout a random sample of districts. And suddenly, under a grant from the National Science Foundation, and suddenly was being attacked quite viciously by a congressman from Missouri who said, it was 1997, Teresa, I know the date because it caused me a heart attack. A congressman who said, oh, you're picking on districts of black members of Congress. Which we weren't. I mean, we had no idea that that's what our sample was as a random sample. It was a guy named William Clay from St. Louis. And I called Barney and I said, Barney, here's the random sample, here's what we did, here's why we're doing it. Can you talk to this person? And Barney talked to Newt Gingrich, and the two of them talked to Clay. Newt Gingrich, for whatever else one wants to think of Newt Gingrich, is an academic, and he understood that what we were doing, and they got them to take off. They were trying to subpoena our records to make us reveal who our respondents were, and we promised confidentiality, and the college was wonderful. I've never forgotten that. My colleague has never forgotten that, because it said, among other things, that the good people who are working in Washington understand both what we're doing as scholars and understand the system that they're part of and how it shouldn't be abused. So I've always thanked Barney for that, and we've been in touch for 50-some years. Hannah, as Patrice alluded, was my student the first time she was ever a student was her senior year at my son, although we had met before. She interviewed me as an echo reporter. And I made the single worst teaching mistake of my teaching career, in which I, in the fall of 2016, went on a rant about the candidate Donald Trump. And it was awful. And it was one of these things, I remember talking to David that very afternoon. I said, you may be getting some phone calls. Because it was like an out-of-body experience. I kept saying to myself, Sandy, you cannot be saying these things about the person who's running for president of the United States, and I couldn't stop myself. And this is the first class with half of the class freshmen. And my other class that semester, as it is this semester, is Ethics in American Politics. So I went to that class and I was explaining the class to them, and I said, well, here's an ethical dilemma. I went into this classroom setting with all these freshmen and said, this vicious attack on the Republican candidate for president. And I said, that's not what being an open classroom, respecting others' opinions is all about. And what do you all think? There were 12 people in the class. Hannah sitting to my far right. They started on the left. Everyone went, that's what he deserved. Go ahead, Sandy. He couldn't be better. And I said, well, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And I noticed Hannah saying nothing. So I said to her, Hannah, you haven't said anything. And she said, I'll never forget this. She said, well, you know, I'm something of a moderate liberal at this point. I don't know what I am really. But when I came to Colby, I was the child of two very Republican parents. And what they cared most about was the government let them do their work and pay for their kids' college education and not get in their way. And I think if you had attacked my parents that way, I never would have looked at you the same. Pit of my stomach, I feel awful. She was clearly very right, and what I took from that, first of all, I went back to my other class the next day and apologized, and told some of the story. But what I took from that is how important it is for Colby students to stand up on their own, to have their views, and be willing to express their views and to state them even when they are in opposition to people in the class and to other professors, and how she modeled that, and modeled that for the class, and modeled to me how you handle that as a professor. We became very good friends after that. She did an independent study with me, and then eventually we collaborated on this book, which looks at how various professions, teachers, clergy, pollsters, and the media respond to Donald Trump and how the ethical dilemmas have to be faced by these. I was very proud, and Jay, I think you will like this, in which my seminar on Wednesday, Jack is in that seminar, I don't know if anybody else is here in the seminar. Sarah's somewhere in the seminar, and Sarah, part of this actually. Sarah Bebo is back there. And Charlie's in the seminar. There are other people in the seminar. I'm looking around, I'm seeing the students. But I know Patrice, how come this last sentence? The debate topic was, the media has acted unethically in covering Donald Trump. And I don't know if it's in the seminar, she was the other person who was in the debate. And the result of a very good discussion was a divided vote on that topic, and in fact came down on the side the media in fact is acting unethically in reporting Donald Trump. They did not, nobody said that what President Trump is doing was ethical, but that the media had a different kind of set of responsibilities. That leads us to today's topic, which is, what is the media's responsibility in covering this election, which is very heated, which is very much controlled, out of their control in many ways. And we have Barney, who I think is one of the most perceptive analysts and observers of national politics, and Hannah, who is going to have responsibility, part of the responsibility for covering the state of Maine in the presidential election as it affects the state of Maine for NewsCenter 6. And I want to start with Hannah and talk about, just ask you to talk about what your mission you think is in covering this election, and briefly about what some of the constraints are and how you cover this election.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll start by saying that I can only really speak from the position of someone who is reporting at a local television station. I've already received one question about network news coverage, and I wish I could speak to that at this point, but not yet. So NewsCenter Maine, we're based in Portland, but we cover the entire state. So we have a hub in Portland and a hub in Bangor. What you see in Presque Isle is what you're also watching in Saco. So it's a big area to cover, and we're the only station in the state that does it. So going into 2020, as far as the presidential election, quite frankly, we don't have the access or the resources to really be able to keep up with what the network's going to be able to give us. And fortunately, we have one of the best partnerships in the country you could have, which is with NBC as our affiliate. So what are the majority of our political coverage as far as the presidential election will be from NBC and what they give us. We also have a lot of sister stations. We're a TEGNA branch, and TEGNA has stations all across the country. So if Elizabeth Warren is in Utah, maybe our station there will be able to feed us back her interviews. So we have partnerships all over the country, and it allows us to piece together some kind of coverage on the presidential election, but not everyone really cares what Elizabeth Warren has to say in Utah, in Maine. And what our focus is going to be when Pat Callahan and I go to New Hampshire will be speaking to these candidates and finding out what they think about the issues that are really specific to Maine. People have so many options as far as finding their political coverage, their presidential election coverage from various outlets, whether it's the major networks to all these different blogs now and online reporting, but there's only a few networks and outlets that are really focused on the issues that are pressing to Mainers. So we really see a responsibility in focusing on that. And I did get an email last week asking why I'm not investigating Hunter Biden, but you know, you can only, we don't feel that that is our responsibility. Our responsibility is to figure out what these candidates are going to do to help Mainers as our population ages. We're one of the oldest populations in the country, and again, just those really specific issues to Mainers. So we will be in New Hampshire for the primaries. Otherwise, in 2020, we're really going to be focusing on this Susan Collins re-election campaign, and I think we have a couple other interesting ballot questions as far as I think it's you can no longer be exempt from getting a vaccine for religious or philosophical beliefs. It's kind of the ones that are at the forefront of my mind. But it'll be really focused on that. That's probably where we'll have a lot of our energy. And it being a presidential election on election night, there'll be a lot of NBC on everyone's TVs, but we'll have our little cut-ins, keeping everyone up to date on what's going on with the Senate election and all the other really specific issues.
Let's focus on the presidential election and go back to the state election somewhat. Barney, what is the press's responsibility when you have at one point 24, now 16 or whatever it is candidates? How much do they play the role of winnowing, or how much is that unfair that they play the role of winnowing?
I should start by a little bit of a disclaimer. There's a whole segment, maybe unfortunately, I think the most influential segment, or at least an increasingly influential segment, is the internet, which I am not deeply engaged in, and I regard as the greatest source of misinformation in the history of the world. And the terrible problem is that people believe stupid things when they hear them, and I don't know how you deal with that, but with regard to the non-internet media, the problem with the media is, interestingly, exactly what they criticize politicians for. That is, refusing to try to lead the public and instead try to figure out what the public wants and give it to them. I think the media is, and it seems to be ironic, they attack politicians who just do a poll to find out what the public wants, and that's what they advocate. You're supposed to show leadership. Well, the media doesn't do that. They're almost explicitly, they're driven by what people are gonna buy, watch, and read. And I would hope they would take a better view, and that is figure out what are the issues that will most affect the country and cover what the candidates think about them. The big challenge now is going to be that impeachment is going to suck all the air out of this. And there are a number of very important issues. Frankly, I think I was, until the Ukraine thing came out, against impeachment. Part of the reason being, or major part of the reason being, that it will end discussion of any other issue, of climate change, of health care, of incomes policies, and I'm afraid the media will do that. They will focus on impeachment to the exclusion of these other issues that they ought to be talking about. It is also clear, again, by this desire to maximize audiences and readerships, that they over-focused on Donald Trump, and in a kind of lean over backwards, which I've seen them do before, were much more critical and focused much more on Hillary Clinton's imperfections than on Trump's. But again, driven by what will sell. And so that's my major criticism of the media. As I said, it is exactly the criticism the media makes of politicians. An eagerness to ingratiate themselves with the public rather than to show any kind of leadership. I cannot think of many cases where the national media has taken the lead in bringing important issues to the forefront.
Do you think that the media has been correct in giving essentially equal time to Marianne Williamson as it does to Cory Booker, as it does to Elizabeth Warren?
Well, I haven't seen them do that, Frank. I mean, the debate is there. As I read the daily press, and as I watch, say, the political channels, MSNBC, CNBC, CNN, and I do tune into Fox. I have been interested in the last couple of weeks that Fox has talked about almost anything but Ukraine. They even they've done a lot of retrospectives on old issues, which is a significant absence of focus. I have found them focus more on the major candidates, which seems to me appropriate. I mean, it would be appropriate now to focus less on the people who haven't done as well. You should start out treating them all equally. But what I wish they would do is talk less about the horse race aspect and more about their substantive positions on these issues, and also talk not just to contrast the Democrats with each other, but the Democrats with Donald Trump. They're very important issues here. And between the horse race and impeachment, that's all you'll hear about.
Hannah, one of the things that I've thought about with NewsCenter and the other affiliates in the state of Maine is, how do you cover all of these candidates? And if what seems to me logical is you cover the candidates who come to Maine, is that giving undue influence to those people simply because they come to Maine? So you had a segment on Buttigieg, you had a segment on Bernie Sanders.
And Booker came to me as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if a candidate is visiting the state, that's news. Ultimately, what we're reporting on is news is the unusual, and presidential candidates in our state, that's a big deal. And we are going to speak to that person and probably give them their voice is being heard exclusively on our newscast that night, unless there are multiple presidential candidates visiting the state. Ultimately, as a Maine local news station, that's all that we can offer. We don't have the same kind of access to every single candidate to be able to get their stances on a specific issue if we have a person visiting our state and give us their take. But what we are going to ask them every time is just really specific and pointed questions to our state, so that they're not giving their maybe blanket statement to our viewers. They can give that on the network news channels, but when they come to Maine, we're going to ask you really pointed questions about how you're going to help our citizens here in the state.
That's one of the things where I regret that. The issues that I think that leads you to kind of strain for a kind of localism that isn't really that important. Some issues like how you're going to affect the elderly, that's a national issue. There wasn't anything particularly Maine about that. And the more you drill down to things that are very specific to Maine, it seems to be frankly less important they are in terms of electing a president. And you can find out what they are saying. I would want all the TV to focus on the most important national issues. I mean, there may be one or two that are very specific. Fishing, for example, is something that's relevant to some coastal states and not others, particularly the kind of fishery we have here. But I think what is important for the local news is to focus on the local issues. You have the referendum you talked about, you have the Susan Collins race, and you have the Jared Golden race. Two very important races because the fate of Congress, and that gets sometimes too little attention. I would, if I were running a news channel here in Maine, I would be giving chicken meat to the networks and the cable channels, which actually do probably the best job of providing the issues in depth. The 4 cable channels, or the 3, really, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, with oil on the economic side from CNBC. But I would, I worry about overemphasis of issues that are frankly marginal when you strain to give a local angle to some of them.
So one of the issues that Democrats feel is important in this election cycle is electability, which is not defined substantively, but it's defined in some ways impressionistically. Do you think the media should be focusing on the electability issue?
Oh yeah, I think it's a very relevant issue from the standpoint of its impact. I don't want them to ignore the Bush race, and I think from the standpoint of the impact of electability and how the voters will vote, yeah, it is a significant issue. The problem is I think they emphasize it to the exclusion of some of the more substantive things, but I think that's very relevant, with the disclaimer that you can't be as certain about this as you might like to be. But electability is I guess the news question is this: not which candidate the media thinks is the most electable, but how is that affecting the voters? What do the voters think about electability, and to what extent is that an influence in their decision making?
So I would criticize the media, asking both of you to respond to this, and saying they have defined electability in 2 ways that I think are, not 3 ways, I guess, I'm not sure are appropriate. One is polls, which are now being done a year before an election, before we know what the issues in the election are going to be. So they do these horse racing out, Trump versus Biden, Trump versus Buttigieg, Trump versus Warren, Trump versus Sanders, whoever it is. Second is crowd size, which in my view, is symptomatic of nothing, other than your ability to get people to a crowd.
Absolutely.
And the third is this financial race, which is going on, and it has driven the candidates to run campaigns other than the kind of campaigns they want to run. For 2 reasons, the Democratic National Committee, to their detriment, has used the number of donors as a way to get in and not get into one of the debates, but also the media has said, where are you as you're reporting these numbers? Are there other ways that they can be measuring the public's view of electability, or are those the only 3 criteria they can rely on? Hannah, what do you think? You can do that as a government major as much as a media.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with what I'm able to do, there's a privilege in being able to have this sort of intimacy with reporting to and for a smaller population, where I am out speaking to Mainers every day, and I have the opportunity, I've done it in every county at this point. And these conversations come up, and just gauging the opinions of a really vast array of different kinds of people from the state. Maine's a really interesting state, that our demographic is just varies widely. We take polls on our morning show, which I was on for a year, and we'll ask different pointed political questions of the impeachment announcement. What are your thoughts, do you think? And you'll get hundreds of votes, and it'll be 50-50 yes and no. So Maine's just a really interesting place to have these kind of discussions with people, and when I'm out speaking to people about different stories that come up across the state, it's something that I will bring up just out of interest, but it's not necessarily a reportable factor. It's just something that we recognize about our state from when we ultimately give our reporting.
I agree with you very much on 2 of the 3 criteria. Crowd size is to some extent a function of socioeconomic status. So poor people work all day, don't come to noon rallies. And old people tend not to want to go outside, particularly as it gets later in the year. So the crowd size is irrelevant. And they do put too much emphasis on the fundraising, and number of donors, I don't understand why that is relevant, especially since it is so easily gamed where people lose money to get donors. And, you know, they all probably pass around, oh, if you give $10, we'll give you these goodies in return. Polls, on the other hand, I think are relevant. First of all, polls are especially relevant, early as it is, on the intra-party issue. The fact that Cory Booker, I mean, you start out and say, gee, who looks good? The fact that Cory Booker, this far into the process, is so low in the polls, it clearly is a sign that he's not appealing to people. Similarly, you know, the Beto O'Rourke, obviously, he took that wild swing on confiscating weapons. It is a relevant screen-out process for people who've been spending a lot of money and have this prominence and haven't caught on. Why they have caught on or not, nobody knows. Although it is interesting, you know, they were really, it was almost like a basketball or a tennis tournament. There were pairings of candidates. And there was Booker and Harris for the African American, Warren and Sanders for the left, Beto O'Rourke and Pete Buttigieg for the fresh, new, young face. And some of those have been decided. I think, interestingly, by the way, just as a comment, which I find encouraging, it's clear to me that Buttigieg got way ahead of O'Rourke in that bracket in substantial part because he's gay. It is not just that Buttigieg has survived being gay. I think that gave him an edge over O'Rourke, although it has limits as far as what would happen in November. But so polls are relevant in that sense, and a poll that was overwhelmingly one way or the other. Now, what's interesting is, so far, and this early, the Democrats versus Trump seem to be clustered, and the differences, 2 or 3 or 4 points, should be ignored. There's no question. But I think the polls do give you a cut who's viable and who isn't. If you know 4 or 5 candidates are ahead of Trump and then 4 or 5 or 10 points below him, then that's a bad sign for them. As to measuring electability, I don't think it's the media's job to measure electability. I think it's the media's job to measure the extent to which the public perceives electability and how much that affects their judgment. And you do that, yes, by polling people, again, not on who's going to win in November, but who do they think today has a better chance in winning in November, and then also doing some in-depth things. Because one of the things you do is to figure, okay, what's Trump going to do against each of these candidates? I mean, for example, it would have been a good idea even a month ago to say, okay, here's Biden, well, what if Trump goes after his family? How's that going to have an impact? But I do think the public view of electability twofold. What do they think about electability, and to what extent does electability impact them? Now, one of the things that could happen is if Trump begins to lose popularity, then electability becomes less important. You know, if any Democrat can win, then your electability, you can go more with your personal preference. If it looks tough, I mean, I remember, although he got it wrong, Kenneth Galbraith in 1960, they thought Nixon was so vulnerable that Galbraith, when asked about the presidency, said, oh, we could beat him with Happy Chandler, who was the senator from Kentucky and then later baseball commissioner. But I think electability may diminish because I think Trump's going to be, his support's going to be eroding, not his firm base, but there's, I think, going to be movement away from him. The less popular Trump appears, the less important electability will be for Democrats, the more confident they are that almost anybody in that top bracket can beat them.
We're going to turn to you all for questions in a minute. We have 3 students, I believe, with microphones around, but while they are getting placed and having those microphones, let me ask Hannah one more question. As we're looking at the Susan Collins challenge, the political insiders all say Sarah Gideon is going to be the person running against her. Betsy Sweet, who ran a very credible campaign in the Democratic gubernatorial primary, is running as well. And there are 2 other candidates. What's your responsibility to cover that race and who those people are? Or do we just say they have no chance and we're just going to focus on you?
They'll all get in-depth profiles. That's what we've done. We did with the congressional campaign in 2016, we sat down with Will Horn and Tiffany Bonds, and I love interviewing them because they are so responsive to Tiffany, and she responds that she wants to chat, and she really wants to get her message out. It's, of course, a lot. It's also really easy to get access to Sarah because she is Speaker of the House. She is filling that role right now, so we are in Augusta speaking to her all the time. That will be a race that I think will really aim to, at least at the beginning, make sure there's a threshold of really equal coverage, and as the race narrows, and then it will probably get more specific to who's going to be Senator Collins' biggest challenger. But at the beginning, they will certainly all get a threshold of equal coverage.
So somewhat parallel to what the national press has done with the Democratic candidates in some.
I'm going to stand up and call people when they have their hands up and have a microphone. Start in the back.
Am I on?
Yep.
So I know that this is largely...
I'm sorry, can you introduce yourself so that...
Sure, Jim Jacobson, a father of both a senior and a first year. I'm very excited to be. So I know this is largely about process, but I'm very interested in the interface between process and substance. And Barney, you mentioned substance. To me, that might raise questions about electability with, say, Elizabeth Warren, and particularly in healthcare. To what extent do you need to move to the center on, say, Medicare for all, or on taxation, or on tech companies to become more electable?
I think that's a central question on the Democratic side right now, and in order to get coverage. I do not think that Medicare for all being enacted right away is either good public policy or sustainable politically. I remember that one of the major initial problems politically with the presidents with Obamacare was that he said, if you like your insurance, you can keep it, and that turned out not to be true. It was both the inaccuracy and the fact that people who were satisfied with insurance didn't want to have to go through all of this. In fact, the very fact that he felt compelled to say that shows people like their insurance. I think it's perfectly plausible to say, we think we'd be better off two things. First of all, if we were starting anew, Medicare for all would be, in a new country, good idea. And maybe that's where we will be 10 years from now. But taking people's insurance away is no good. Even Sanders had to admit that there was a problem there when he came out with what seemed to me kind of a cockeyed approach to taking care of union contracts. So he said that if you're in a union, you have a contract which gives you health care, we will cost out how much that is, and we will make them give that to you in wage increases. Impossible to enforce, very hard to calculate. So I do think that, now it's interesting with Elizabeth Warren, she's given very detailed, very thoughtful plans on everything except health care. On health care, her response is, I'm with Bernie. Clearly, again, it's this bracket deal. She and Sanders are, although it's interesting, demographically they had different people they were appealing to. Hers more the college educated, his more the younger people, but still there's a competition there. I think she felt compelled to come out for Medicare for all, the Sanders plan, to get that issue off the table as an issue between her and Sanders. To the extent that he is now clearly no longer going to be a major contender. The heart attack doesn't help, but also he was losing to her badly before, increasingly so. The interesting question is now that Warren has less to worry about competing with Sanders and more to worry about competing first with Biden and then with Trump, will that lead her to modify Medicare for all? She has still not yet put out her own. I hope she does, because I do think it makes her unelectable. I mean, even Medicare for all, even if you're on Medicare now, most people who are on Medicare, or a very substantial percentage, have a private insurance policy. They have a supplemental policy. Well, how does that get dealt with? That gets turned around. So I think you've asked a very important question. The fact is, that's important for this reason. Absent that, if you talked about a buy-in for Medicare, optional Medicare, it's a great issue with which the Democrats beat Trump over the head. It helped in 2018, It's a very good distinction. He's all over the lot on it. So that, I think, does the demise or the decline of Sanders give Warren the room to modify the position of Medicare for all? Say, look, that's the ultimate goal, but we won't get there unless people like it, and let's phase it in. I would add, too, that I'm a great believer in government. I think the notion that government doesn't do any good, et cetera, is crazy, but it's not an easy instrument to wield. And implementing Medicare for all in a short period of time could do more harm than good, because it's hard to see that being done as smoothly as you would want to be to set it as a precedent.
Other question? I need somebody to flash. Yep, back there, way in the back.
I think I've noticed a huge change.
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, Peter Benet, parent. I think I've noticed in the last month a huge change in journalistic ethics, in that I've never seen before the president speaking on television, and on the bottom of the screen it says, "This man is currently lying." And this is not true what you're hearing. I've never seen that before, and I just wonder if anybody wants to comment on the press shifting coverage in that way.
Yeah, we wrote about this in our book, how the New York Times made a really kind of distinctive choice in 2016 to use the word lie in an article before, because lie implies that there is malicious intent, whereas speaking something that might be not true is different. So they, I guess, I imagine, had a kind of editorial meeting where a decision was made that there was malicious intent behind a statement that was made during the campaign. Has that become normalized? I'm not sure, and I can't speak for every outlet, of course, but I know that the choice to use that word has been something that weighs on a lot of different outlets, and that we, at least at NewsCenter Maine, certainly would never use lightly in reporting on the president.
I think what you see is kind of an effort by the media to undo the mistake. I think accurately they believe that they were much too willing to be a megaphone for Trump's statements, whether they were true or not true, and now believe that they erred, and that it is important that they not simply be used for that way. It is I think it's legitimate for them to do it. They have to be absolutely certain that they're doing it fairly. They do it to everybody, and I mean, the fact check in general is a good idea, but I think Trump tells more lies, but he's not the only one. So I think if they do that consistently, that's perfectly reasonable. Especially, you don't do it lightly, as Hannah said, but there are cases where he knows that's not true. Even worse, if he says it and he thinks it's true, he's delusional. But and other candidates have done that too. Look, they made a big deal out of Joe Biden's botching up that story about the guy who didn't want to medal. They've done that to others as well. Trump does do it more than anybody else, and I think, as I said, they're being more explicit now because they retroactively understand that they helped him by allowing him unhindered to spread things that weren't true, and as long as they do that to everybody, it's a good thing. The problem is they're competing with the internet, and that's one reason why as I get older, I think back, Sandy was talking about our being together in a class in 1963. Project that backwards. That meant if we were talking in 1963 to someone who had been teaching someone else in the same time span, it would have been during the presidency of either William McKinley or Theodore Roosevelt. We're talking about more than 50 years prior to that. But
I think I have to sit down.
I have to say it, as I get older, and I'm glad, obviously I'm feeling okay, but I am terrified well, deeply regretful that two of the things on which I have relied for my life are in danger of collapsing. Newspapers and my spine. I deeply regret the shift from media, as much as I'm sometimes critical of them, to the internet. People need a filter. I've had people tell me, young people, oh, I read that on the internet. Well, when I was their age, I read that on the internet, which is equivalent of saying, somebody told me. That's all it means. There's no filter. You don't have to persuade anybody of anything. You just put it out there. The gullibility of too much of the public is a problem. And I miss this filter. And I think part of the problem in 2016 was that they abandoned their responsibility to be something of a filter, lest they be accused of bias. I think that I welcome the fact that that at least is no longer there in the professional media. The problem, of course, is that it is absent. And I don't know if anybody's on polls, but I'd be interested in the degree of gullibility about outlandish things between people who rely mostly on newspapers and TV news and those who rely on the internet. And my guess is that the people who rely on the professional media, which is somewhat filtered, are much better informed and, I guess, much less badly misinformed than the people who go directly to the internet.
Barney, you might have trouble with your physical spine, but I don't think any of us think you'll have any trouble with your intellectual spine. But most of us have cared about it over a period of time. Other questions out there? I see a hand, and I don't know if they have a mic going that way.
Hi.
Rachel.
My name is Rachel Powers. I'm a junior global studies and government double major, creative writing minor. I'm curious, how do you see the implementation of ranked choice voting in Maine as affecting media coverage of the presidential election, or do you even think that will affect media coverage at all?
Does it apply to the presidential election?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Just a bill just went through this legislature, not to the primary, but to the general election.
I think at the last election we had, one of our reporters was at the ranked choice voting headquarters because that in 2016 that was on the ballot. So the last presidential election we were also voting on ranked choice voting. So it's unprecedented. It'll absolutely be something that we discuss. In a presidential election, it's because there will be two likely candidates on that ballot. It's different, but our congressional elections, and we saw it in 2018, decide the Poliquin-Golden election. And then thereafter we followed the coverage as Poliquin appealed it. So it's certainly something that's on our radar. It's on the radar of national news organizations that the Poliquin appeal did make national headlines. It makes Maine really unique, and it makes it a fun place to be reporting on politics right now. And in the presidential election, not sure exactly how that will play out unless there's a strong independent.
Sure, unless there's a third-party candidate.
Yeah.
The reason the ranked choice voting people put that in, the bill in, was not about the general election, although they did put it in the general election. Well, it's because ranked choice voting is a terrific mechanism for dealing with 16 candidates on the ballot and figuring out what an election really means. And you can do it easily with a 15% threshold, which Maine has. Hannah's absolutely right. In the general election, it will not have an impact unless there's a third candidate running in the general election, in which case it could have a real impact.
Can I say, it could, at this point, it does not look like there's going to be a third party on the right because of all the challenges that Trump said they're going to run as Republican. It's been a problem for the Democrats, both with Ralph Nader in 2000 and with in this past election, where you have people on the left taking votes away from the Democrat. Two things. First of all, it's hard for me to believe that a significant number of people who wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton because she didn't meet their standard don't regret that, if they've seen what it has brought. We can thank them for Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. That ought to be diminished. The second question is If it hasn't, we're gonna find out, will they, the people, there'll probably be Jill Stein or somebody else running from the left. The question will be, are the people voting for her or the equivalent gonna rank the Democrat as second? My guess is there'll be fewer people voting for that person because of the disastrous results of what they did last time, but those that do will be hardcore and will not put a second choice on.
Interesting.
Josh. Hi, I'm Josh Browse. I'm a first year. I'm in Sandy's 111 class on American politics. For the past couple decades or so, up to very recently, issues like climate change have been regarded with kind of little attention from major media outlets, specifically for the reason that they were ratings killers, and they were not really profitable or incentivized to give them that much attention. And I think that really speaks to what you were talking about earlier with media needing to take leadership, but it's really hard for them to do that when they're worried about competition from other outlets. Currently, we have HBO on streaming platforms. Their streaming platform has Axios, which doesn't have to worry about competition. In England, they have TV licenses for BBC. We have PBS here that's publicly funded. Those three networks don't have to worry about competition, and they're much more able to take a lead on what they're able to kind of push out to their viewers. I guess my question is, how do you see media outlets being able to evolve so that they're able to take leadership rather than having to appease their audiences?
I'd say two things. First of all, the justification that I can't take a principled stand because I have competition is one that the media rejects when it comes to politicians. A politician who says, oh, I'm sorry, I can't be for serious climate change legislation because it'll lose me votes, would get attacked by the very media, which is doing exactly what you said. So if competition, if fear of losing out to competition is a good explanation, well, it's an explanation, not necessarily justification. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, it's a kind of interactive thing. One of the, and this has been a problem I've observed for environmental issues became issues really in the 70s. And during that entire nearly 50 years, 40 plus years, it has not had political impact because the voters don't care about it as much. And remember, what a politician wants to know, to the extent that he or she is calculating, is not what do people think about that issue, but to how many people is it a vote influencing issue? To what extent will influence their votes? Until recently, that's why gun control was a political loser. Because, well, a majority would tell you if asked that they wanted tighter regulations on guns, 90% of the people whose votes would be influenced by that were people who didn't want those. I think that's changing now. With regard to climate change, the environment in general, the environment never seemed to be shifting votes. It was particularly a factor, frankly, with a lot of suburban Republicans before Trump, because Republicans paid no price for being somewhat disregardful of the, that's like impactful, of the environmental issue. Climate change is now broken through. So it's getting covered, and it's a combination. I mean, you can't say it's a vicious cycle. Well, the public wasn't interested because the press didn't pay attention. I think environmental issues, you know, they're hard to focus on. They're air, they're water, they're generalized. Climate change has caught the public's attention. And the media is now giving it a lot of coverage because the public has gotten interested. So that dilemma of it not being covered because it's not good for, it's not good clickbait, it's not a good way to get viewers, that's over. Climate change has now become one of the primary national issues, and I think is going to have a big impact, although all issues will now have less impact because of the focus on impeachment.
Dick.
My name is Dick Schmaltz. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Dick Schmaltz. I'm a graduate, as my wife and parent and grandparent. And I'm not sure you have the answer to this, but it's something that I hear about in my circle of people. And that is, you talked about two of the real problems America's confronting in the political process: money and internet. And the question we talk about, are the best people really, do they really want to run for Congress, for the presidency. With all the witch hunts that are going on and all the demands to raise money, I've heard stories that as soon as you're elected in Washington, one of the first things you hear is $16,000 a day. And that kind of mentality is discouraging. So the question, and I complimented you earlier because you're a good listener and you got things done. And you are a statesman. I guess you call them statespeople today. The question is, are they being attracted to run for Congress today, or is the system you're concerned about a discouragement to the quality really coming to the top?
A very good question. I'd say, first of all, the discouragement factor is out there even more for appointed positions. And that's where we pay a price. Because you can expect to be attacked for everything you ever did or your relatives did. And I think it does discourage some people from appointed positions. The ego gratification for elections are higher than for appointments. So I don't think it's had as much of a deterrent effect. But it has had some. With regard to money, the chance to do something about that was lost in 2016. The Supreme Court, if Hillary Clinton had won, and Merrick Garland or somebody similar had been confirmed, the Supreme Court would have reversed the decision, Citizens United and others, which opened the floodgates to unlimited money. Absent a change in the Supreme Court membership, not much can be done. The only thing you can do if you don't like all that bad money is to give some good money and try and diminish its effect. I mean, people who don't like the negative influence of campaign contributions have to adopt a reverse Gresham's rule. Gresham's rule wasn't bad money drives out good money. The reverse is to give enough good money to diminish the impact of bad money. But I do think, yes, there is some discouragement. I notice it, by the way, and I've talked to friends of mine who are all state legislators, I would. We've noticed it at the state legislative level and at the municipal level. On the presidential level, I would say it does not seem to be working that way. At least, we have too many candidates, not enough. I mean, the Republicans had that in 16. The Democrats have it now. The internet may be facilitating this somewhat. But below the presidency, yes, I think it does have a negative impact. And it's both in people running and in appointed positions. I think it's a very difficult, people who are offered, say, a cabinet job, I think some of them are deterred.
I think probably college students here would say that they don't watch any network, and they don't read any newspapers. So there's certainly the bad side, but somehow there has to be a way to get through the fake news that you talk about. Given the fake news that you talk about, and Trump's call that all news is fake except for some Fox coverage, what do you think that the long-term effect is on society's ability to parse what's true and not true, and the credibility of whoever the news outlet is?
Well, you say be careful about being critical. No, I accept the fact that younger people overwhelmingly get their news from various internet sources rather than from the full media, but to me that's more reason to be critical. I think to answer your last question, the result is the debasement of the political debate. Because there is no filter. What several of us have said, the questions and my response has been that we wish that the media was more resistant to the temptation to just go with what sells the most and has the most public appeal. Well, that's a criticism to some extent of the media, but it's mostly a criticism of the public. I mean, what we're saying is that the public in this sense is a bad influence, that their baser instincts seem to drive their viewing and reading habits more than they should. And the only thing I want to sort of combat that, and in terms of, I agree, getting people who don't like it, the convenience, a whole lot of other reasons, to go to newspapers or to the political channels, and again, I stress it, particularly Fox, CNN, CNBC, Bloomberg. What I wish we could do was to teach skepticism. I will have a quote that one of the great journalists of my era, Bob Kaiser, who was at the Washington Post deputy managing editor, quoted one of his colleagues as saying, about 10 years ago, "I wish young journalists today were as skeptical of bad news as they are of good news." And I wish that was true of people who read, who get their information from the internet. So what I would hope would be a campaign to say, look, you're going to do this, but please be skeptical. If there is something extraordinary and outrageous that you've never heard from any other source, it probably isn't true. And at least don't be as gullible. And so I accept that I'm not going to get people to start reading newspapers. But the plan B is to have them be somewhat skeptical of what they get on the in the social media.
Let me, we don't have time for just one more question as we have a hard stop at 10:45, but I just want to say to the parents in this room, in my class last Thursday, I was talking to my students about where they get their news, the very questions that you're dealing with here, and I think the plurality view and the best view was either my mother or my father sends me news clips every morning that they think I should be listening. And I just want to say, I also talk about the fact that these students have never heard of Walter Cronkite and how sad that is. They just look at me like, who is Walter Cronkite? But those of us who are in Maine, I think have the same feeling of credibility about Pat Callahan and Cindy Williams, who have been NewsCenter anchors for 29 years or something like that. I don't know how many years it is, but they have been here for a very long time and have built up this feeling of crability in the news that they bring forth. So you can carry that home to them. Is there one more?
One thing I was struck, Cokie Roberts was a friend of mine for many, many years. I was struck by the number of people who told me what an impact she'd made. How she had, was a leading advocate for particularly women who felt special. Though she did tell me, one of the things that I learned from her was that women journalists, TV journalists, are not allowed to have gray hair. That they have to dye their hair. The guys can have gray hair, but the women have to dye their hair.
Last question over here.
So simply put, the term breaking news used to mean a program is going to be interrupted, and now we're going to deliver the news story. Now everything is breaking news.
I think that's true.
Yeah, they treated it to the point where, but again, that's another criticism. The emphasis is on being the first, being exclusive, rather than being first. I had that argument once actually with Sam Donaldson. They said, they make a big deal about who was the first on a presidential election night to declare a state won somebody. Who cares? What difference it makes, literally, if you learn it 15 minutes later? And I think in that rush, there is sometimes a sacrifice of accuracy.
Yeah, I think there is a pride in being first
Why?
to a story.
Why? State going, if it's something, let me make this a
That might be different.
Here's the deal. If you break a story that would not otherwise have come out, I think that's something to be proud of. But if you are the first by a fairly small amount of time, even an hour, to bring out a story that everybody's going to know anyway, it doesn't do the viewer any good.
I think being the first station that someone turns to, or the first outlet someone turns to when they want the latest and the newest, we're in an era where everyone wants everything as fast as possible, as quickly as possible. So I do think there's a pressure to be first to the story, whether it's for
I think
better or
that's
not.
self-generated. When I talk to people, they don't rush to, oh, I'm going to watch Channel 7, I'm going to watch Channel 7, I'm going to watch CNBC because they'll be an hour earlier.
And people develop relationships with their news networks, and they trust certain ones to be not just first, but also most thorough.
That's more important. I agree with what you just said.
Yeah, they know that this outlet is going to be the most of whatever they want, whether it's fastest or most thorough. So,
Patrice.
So,
Lador, from generation to generation, right? From the parents in this room to the students, learning from each other, hopefully taking home some of the exciting things happening in our classroom and those news clippings. Lador, from the donors in this room to the students who are going out and changing the world. And from generation to generation, the generations represented here. Thank you, Barney Frank. Thank you, Hannah Dineen. Thank you, Sandy.